is that because of their idolatry, the harmonious plan of marriage is not going to be harmonious. Now, why is this? Because in eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, both the man and the woman have made the decision, each of them individually and independently, to take the place of God. They have both decided that, right? It's not one or the other. They have both decided, I will eat that tree. I will be in the place of God. Now, what's going to happen necessarily there is they're definitely going to have conflict. Why is that? Because if I'm standing under God and I have the willingness to dethrone God himself, why have I done that? So that I can sit on that throne, right? Now, if I'm willing to dethrone God himself to sit on that throne, what are the chances that I'm going to allow another human being to sit on it? Exactly zero. Right? If I have made the decision to posture myself up against God himself, there's not a snowball's chance that I'm going to let you sit on that throne. I kicked God off of it to take his place. I'm not letting you sit on it. And so they're both deciding that they're not going to submit to God. And having dethroned him, neither one of them is going to let the other person ascend it. So now what's the application then? What is this saying? It's saying that marriage is going to be difficult and stained by sin. And this will show up in many different ways, in different relationships. If you're married here today, then think about how has the stain of independence, of sin, of narcissism, of idolatry, of selfishness, how has it showed up in your marriage? What kinds of conflict have you had with your spouse, and why did they happen really? Is it not true that all of your conflict with your spouse comes somewhere from people's competing selfish desires? Is it not true that the vast majority of the conflict that you experience comes from people's selfishness that collides with somebody else's selfishness? And you're like, well, wait, Brian, but sometimes people are just abusers. Okay, sure, yes. But most often, that's probably not the case. Most often, what's the rule that we would say usually in human conflict? It takes two to tango. Yeah? Of course, I know there's outliers there. And so sometimes, this is a reality in our world. Sometimes wives will be rightly devoted to their husbands, and their husbands nonetheless will respond with tyranny and abuse. That is a category. And I don't want to say that never happens. That does happen. That does happen. There are marriages in which a wife is actually devoted to and loves and takes care of her husband to the very best of her ability, and he nonetheless is just an abusive man. Yes, that's a category. Now, what would we say to that? Well, hopefully, if that kind of thing happens in the church, then the men of that church go and they have a hard conversation with that man. And they rebuke him. And they come around that family, right? That's what we would say there. Now, sometimes, though, marital conflict comes a different way. Sometimes the conflict comes because both men and women are narcissistic, selfish people. Yes? I think if you're honest and you're married, you're thinking like, man, my spouse, they're trouble sometimes. But then immediately the Spirit of God says, so are you. So are you. And so sometimes what happens is that Genesis 4 meaning of the word desire, sometimes that is present. Sometimes there is this like, I'm gonna rise up against my spouse. And I'm gonna assert myself against them. I'm gonna control them. I'm gonna manipulate them. I'm gonna undermine them. That might be very quiet or it might be very explicit. Sometimes women will very quietly, but willfully and intentionally, undermine and manipulate their husband. Do you think that happens? Got real quiet in here all of a sudden. I think it happens. We'll get to the men. We'll get to the men. Don't worry about it. And sometimes it's outright. It's explicit. It's like an explicit undermining. Perhaps sometimes, I think about the woman here in Genesis 3. Perhaps sometimes women feel that their resentment of their husband is justified. Have you ever felt that? You don't have to raise your hand. But ladies, if you're married, have you ever resented your husband? And then if I were to ask you, could you make a pretty good case why that resentment was justified? And I think you probably could. I think Eve could have, right? Eve could have made a case. The devil comes and he's fighting with her. He's trying to deceive her, and her husband's standing there doing exactly nothing, right? I think Eve could be forgiven for thinking like, maybe I should be in charge. Because look, I could do a better job than him. He's passive and stood by when he should have been contending against the serpent. And as a result of his passivity, everything went sideways. So it'd be understandable, right? And I think that same temptation comes today. I do think that God has crafted marriage in such a way, and I said this last week to you men, whether you're married or not, okay, if you're not married, you're going to be married at some point, you better get this through your understanding. God has created you to be actually protector, guardian, leader, spiritually of your home. God has created you men to be the pastor, the shepherd of your own home. And you bear more responsibility for your family than I do. Now, on the flip side of that, what will happen is the ladies will sometimes see their husband not doing that role exactly how he should. And then what will creep in is, I could probably do better. So what can come then is either the quiet or the explicit. Undermining, manipulation, control, critique. And I think that by and large, if women do this, they will get one of two things. I'm talking very practically here. They will either get a man who wants to avoid the conflict altogether and so becomes passive and disengaged, or they'll get the man who responds to conflict with overwhelming force and tyranny. And there you actually have Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16. Adam in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1 through 7 is passive and disengaged and disinterested and not actually there. And then what God says is, now what's going to happen afterward? He's going to become a tyrant. And he's going to be an authoritarian abuser. Now, I am not going to stand up here and blame women for the abuses of men. Absolutely not. God, as we'll see, has the most to say to Adam. At no point ever is a man justified in abusing a woman. Not at all. What I'm saying is that because of human idolatry and sin, there is destined to be conflict in marriage because both sides are going to want to assert themselves and at times over against the other person. And what God says to the woman in Genesis 3:16 is, that's not going to be a winning proposition for you. And what I'll say is this: women in our culture today, it's not a winning proposition to try to go to war with men. I'm not saying that to say, oh, men are going to be justified in whatever they do, but it's not a winning proposition. You go to war with a man, with your husband, and he will either do what he feels is the honorable thing and totally disengage, and someday you'll be left wondering, like, why do I have a passive, disengaged, disinterested husband and father? Or he will do the dishonorable thing. Well, these are both dishonorable, but the more explicitly dishonorable thing, and he will attack you and traumatize you and he'll abuse you. None of that will ever, ever, ever be justified. But mark this, it is because of our human idolatry and our sin, both of us, that we have conflict